So recently, the amazing atheist and Paul, who in this has changed his name to Hippie, I think in response to me calling them hippies, talk about American aid and the challenges that it's facing at the end of this year as the Republicans are trying to tie it to immigration reform. And it turns into a wider conversation about whether we should continue to send Ukraine money and their views on the war, which we've talked about before. But then I get brought up because, you know, I've disagreed with them in the past. But I wanted to watch this because, well, number one, aid is in the news again, and I want to cover aid as much as possible while it's in the news again because it's an important issue, and we only have a few days left until the legislative agenda for this year ends, and we won't be able to talk about passing aid packages again until next year. But also, my name was brought up, so, you know, all streamers are a little egotistical. If my name was brought up, I feel like I have a you know, not a responsibility to respond, but, you know, at least the right to listen to what was said. Jingo J, thank you so much for the primer. Means so for 8 months. Sorry I'm late. I fell asleep. Did I miss anything good? Nope, we're about to start. So yeah, let's just hear what they have to say about Ukraine aid. I've been critical of them in the past. I've said that Paul particularly, I think they're both of their views is a kind of, I use the word hippie, maybe peacenik would be better. I think both of their views are lean towards that more. But the problem with Paul, I still love TJ, okay, even if I call him a hippie. The problem with Paul is that he's just very confident in his ignorance, and where he knows he's knowledgeable about these things, but he'll say things that he doesn't have knowledge of very confidently. And that isn't me saying that I think that like Paul is a know-it-all. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'll say is like he'll just kind of like jump. I feel like a lot of times he'll just kind of jump to conclusions in his head and then run off of that conclusion. And hasn't done this research to go see if that's true before making bold statements on his internet program, which, you know, I think that's a problem. Let's watch this. I think I'll have a few moments where I can talk about that problem in this segment. But yeah, let's review.
Zelensky makes 11th hour plea for Ukraine war funds in Washington.
Oh God.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Tuesday plans a last-ditch plea to U.S. lawmakers to keep military support flowing as he battles Russia and visits the White House and Capitol Hill. Heading into winter with tens of thousands of Ukrainians dead, a yawning budget deficit, and Russian advances in the east, Zelensky is scheduled to press U.S. lawmakers to replenish nearly depleted funding before meeting with President Joe Biden. If there's anyone inspired by unresolved issues on Capitol Hill, it's just President Vladimir Putin and his sick clique, or clique, as some people like to say. Zelensky said at a speech in Washington on Monday to U.S. military audience. Newly declassified U.S. intelligence shows that Russia seems to believe that a military deadlock through the winter will drain Western support for Ukraine and ultimately give Russia the advantage despite Russian losses, said Adrian Watson, spokesperson for the White House National Security Council. It's looking like...
So to be clear, I do want to say, and I've said this on the show before, but I just want to reemphasize it, that the hope that Russia has isn't that necessarily in the long run in a slugging match with the West, that the West's military production capacity in Europe, plus the United States, and possibly the Asian Pacific, the Koreans have actually given more shells towards the fight for Ukrainian independence than all of Europe has. The South Koreans transferred over 500,000 shells to the United States to help transfer more shells to Ukraine. And the Europeans, while they pledged to have 1 million shells to the Ukrainians by the end of the year, haven't even hit 50% of that number. So I do just want to quickly throw out there that his plan, Putin's plan, is to stop that aid because they think that probably in a long slug match versus Ukraine and the West, the odds of Russia winning and taking over all of Ukraine or taking many of the objectives they have or stopping the Ukrainians from possibly even pushing them back, all of that is highly, highly in doubt. Whereas if they were able to whittle down Western support for Ukraine, then at the very least, they can keep pushing, take Donetsk, take Luhansk, try to take more land, and if we believe if we are to believe the Russians are need a rest, or if we were to believe that what some of my biggest critics would say, at that point they would stop. They would stop at that point, and then they negotiate a deal, and then they, you know, come together, kumbaya or some shit, and then they find some deal that would bring everybody together. My main problem with this scenario is, number one, I'm still not sold on selling away all the Ukrainian land. Number two, what can we do to stop the Russians from attacking again once this deal is negotiated? And number three, we can still put more chess pieces on the board regardless if we enter into negotiations or not. We need to be able to say, like, you know, no in negotiations. We need to have refusals. If the Russians start saying Ukraine has to give up all of its weapons, like was one of the original demands as they invaded, that has to be a refusal point. Because if the Ukrainians disarm, obviously we can see how that's a security risk to the nation that was just invaded for like the third or fourth time in the last, you know, 8 years, 8 to 10 years. So I want to have refusal points. I want to make sure that we can say no. There's so much that I want to get for Ukraine, but no matter if we negotiate a deal now or we negotiate a deal later, or if the Ukrainians push them out, no matter what, it's going to help the Ukrainians if they have more chess pieces on the board during negotiations, because hard power does impact their negotiating capability. So I just want to throw out there that even if we were to go with TJ's plan for immediate negotiations that would succeed, which I'm just saying, I think the odds of it succeeding are very low, but let's say we were to go with TJ's plan, the best case scenario would still be sending them weapons so that their negotiating capability is at its best. So even in the scenario where I'm kind of going all over the place a little bit, but I just wanted to say quickly, even in the scenario where TJ gets what he wants and they have immediate negotiations, what would be best is for them to have the most strength that they can bring to the negotiating table to get the best deal. The point is, I was replying to someone else like, what are you guys arguing in chat already? We just started the segment. You guys are already arguing in chat. What the plan is for Putin isn't to necessarily outfight the West when it comes to their production capacity, because in the long run, it is highly in doubt whether or not they can do that. The plan is to undercut aid, to stop Ukraine from having a strong negotiating position in negotiations that they engage in. And so if he chooses to, which so far he's choosing to, he can continue to press the advance and try to take Donetsk and Luhansk and more land, possibly in other locations, like in Zaporozhye.
This funding is not going to materialize for this conflict to continue. Biden did send $200 million because he could authorize that without congressional support, but it doesn't look like he's going to get more of these funds voted for unless he does some sort of ridiculous border policy, this or that.
I think there's a chance.
I don't think it's actually going to. I think they're actually trying to hold it to the 11th hour. We're not going to do it.
I think there's a chance at the 11th hour that Biden is going to, you know, maybe not give him everything he's asking for, but there might be a couple more doses of money in the teat. But ultimately, I think the people's, like, just the interest level of the American people is waning. There's a new war. There's a new shiny war now going on. So that Ukraine thing, that's so 2022, dude.
Let me just quickly say before we get trapped in something else. I think the odds of a deal being made in the next 3 days, which is how long we have until the legislative session ends and we don't open until next year, I think the odds are low. I've seen some reporting from CBS News showing that the Biden administration, and if you just look at his public statements, they are willing to make compromises, quite significant compromises, if the CBS reporting is to be believed. So it's not impossible, but also negotiations would reopen starting next January. So, you know, like 15 to, 20, 25 days from now. And then they would continue to try to find some solution to get Ukraine aid overseas. Now, I'm not saying that Ukraine aid is significant. Like, I know Ukraine is going to succeed, but there's still 3 days until the end of the session. Well, now at least 48 hours until the end of the session. And then we have January where they're going to be negotiating stuff as well if it fails, which I think it likely will this week. So we still have quite a lot of time. And the Republicans are still willing to at least entertain Ukraine aid. That's the whole gambit around the immigration question to begin with. So we'll see what Biden's willing to concede on immigration, and we're willing to see if the Republicans are willing to also hold back Israel aid, the billions that are tied to the Ukraine package, in order to hold up Ukraine aid, in order to leverage the border. We'll see, but we still have time, and I still think that there's a good chance that Ukraine aid will get through and there'll be some compromise found. Because I do think that both Democrats and Republicans still think it's within the national security interest of the United States.
Like, let's be honest with you, dude. Are you fucking stuck in the past, bro? That was ages ago. And that's kind of like exactly, by the way, not to fucking toot my own horn. I know it probably gets old hearing me say it, but that's exactly what I said as soon as this conflict started and America's involvement became apparent. I said, we are going to fund this until it's no longer politically advantageous, and we're going to leave these fucking people out to dry in a destabilized, fucked up country with a bunch of American weapons swimming around in it.
Well, the American weapons swinging around in it is not the problem. The problem would be that there's not enough American weapons swimming down in it, that they're swimming not in enough American weapons to hold back the Russians or to have leverage in negotiations. No matter what, if we want to help the Ukrainians negotiations, and this is the thing that always gets me, they're going to need weapons. The Ukrainians can't negotiate from a power of no, from a position with zero hard power, where they're just completely running off of their old Soviet stockpiles forever. They're negotiating against the second most powerful nation in the world. They're going to need weapons to do it. The problem is not that they have American weapons. The problem is they don't have enough American weapons to make the Russians respect their sovereignty. They need enough weapons and enough diplomatic backing, either of NATO or some other power, in order to make the Russians respect their sovereignty. Whether they make a deal to give up territory, which would still be a disastrous scenario, or they don't. They're still going to need a significant amount of American weapons and hard power. And even if all aid was to end tomorrow, American aid still helped them in taking back the only provincial capital that the Russians captured in the whole war, Kherson. It helped them take back large areas around Kharkiv and make the city safer. And it has contributed to the air defense of cities like Kiev and other major population centers. So even if aid was to stop tomorrow, we still help them retain land, we still help them take back land, and we still help them give them a better negotiating position, showing that Ukraine, which back in 2014 only had 6,000 soldiers that could stand up and were competent and were active duty military that were combat ready, to where they are today, fielding hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers in complex military operations, backed with quality American hardware. Small amounts of quality American hardware. American aid levels to Ukraine are at the lowest levels since they were pre-invasion, but that's what they're able to achieve. The problem here, in my analysis, isn't that they have American weapons. The problem here, in my analysis, is a lack of American dedication to U.S. allies, which isn't just a problem here, it's a problem in other locations as well. And I think Paul has identified part of the problem. The kind of, oh, this is important, oopsie daisy, moving on to the next thing. That's a problem with U.S. policy, that kind of low attention span. But the solution isn't to accept that we have a low attention span and to just disengage from international politics. It's to have more long-term thinking.
Great. And that's exactly what's happening.
So Ukraine has obviously suffered pretty badly from this. Russia also has suffered pretty greatly. 87% of its troops, and I think something like a third of its military hardware have, I'm sorry, 2/3 of its pre-invasion tanks, and I think like a third of its aircraft. Just massive losses trying to secure Ukraine. Obviously, Ukrainian soldiers, I think the median age of a Ukrainian soldier is now like in their 40s or like late 30s or something, because so many of their recruits have died or, abandoned the cause or whatever else, might have happened along the way.
So there's a few things I want to say here. The number of 87% that he's talking about is the percentage of the total number of active duty ground troops that they put into the country prior to launch. Well, that was the percentage of active duty ground troops they had prior to launching the invasion. Since then, of course, they've had to massively increase the size of their invasion force. So they've recruited a lot more conscripts. They've increased the payments for people who accept contracts. They've done a lot of recruitment in the prison systems. By some estimates, like the Russian prison system has lost a population of like 30 to 40% of its prisoners. So they are recruiting a lot of prisoners for Wagner and other combat battalions, other combat groupings. So they have done their best to try to make up the loss. So these numbers are from a U.S. intelligence assessment, and they seem to be within a range that is believable. The 315,000 casualties is, while high, was within range that analysts definitely thought was believable or thought was in the range of believability. So I think we have a decent reason to not take this analysis or take this report from U.S. intelligence at 100% face value, accepted as gospel, but there's a really good chance that it's true. And what he's referring to is that they also lost, I think it was 2/3 of their tanks and 1/3 of their armored vehicles, like AFVs, armored fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers, APCs. So Russia has lost a lot, and that's why they've had to bring back a lot of old Soviet gear, bring a bunch of ammunition that used to not be good for service, that they declared, hey, this is no longer fit for service, declare it fit for service, scramble around the world for, North Korean shells, because they just cannot match that initial combat power that they threw into the country, whether it has to do with the quality to the training of the soldiers, whether it has to do with the amount of shells they were firing in the first 10 months of the war between February 2022 and the end of the year. They fired 10 to 11 million shells. And the goal for them is to hit like 2 million shells a year by 2025. So they just cannot replenish that. They're replenishing, they're losing armor at a rate that is just not, that they're not able to replenish. They can keep activating old stockpiles, but that only goes so far. It's also old stockpiles, so these things have equipment failings. And, the further you go back and the older armor you reactivate, the higher the chance the stuff is just not going to work. This is a point I brought up to them in the past. So this U.S. intelligence report just reiterates what other reports and other analysts had talked about before, but it just shows it in, I think, the clearest, starkest terms. As for the average age of the Ukrainian soldier, this isn't to be surprised. I would imagine that the Russians probably have, even though we don't have any data on it, they probably have a population graph when it comes to their armed forces that is very similar, probably something near 42, 43 years old. And I think this less has to do with how what TJ indicated, which was they've taken such massive losses, and that so many people have, quote unquote, abandoned the cause, that they've just had to recruit more and more elderly people. If you account for the population graph in Ukraine, which saw its demographics, I don't want to say collapse, but its birth rate heavily reduce after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they have a large population of late 30s, 40s, and 50s. That's where a large portion of their population is going to come from the period before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then you exclude the very young and the very old, and you account on the population graph for the population that's, recruitable. And you account for the fact that the demographic spike in the end of the Soviet Union and the decline afterwards, you're going to have an average age of about 41. So 43 is the average age, so there's still a 2-year difference, but this, of course, also doesn't include exemptions, which includes, for example, university students. If you're in university, which tends to skew young, you can get out of military service. There are significant protections for people without military service experience between the ages of 18 and 27, even if there have been discussions of reducing it from 18 to 25. I don't know if it's gone anywhere since the last time I've done any research. And there are, of course, also exemptions for the sick, which will favor the elderly. So, but I do think that if you account for those protections, that it makes sense that the number is 43, even if the population graph would have it at 41. But still, it's in the range that you would expect once you mobilize the general population, as Ukraine has. I do want to throw out there that there's also an active conversation, active debate happening within Ukrainian society about the draft, about whether there should be as many protections as there are for people who are between the ages of 18 to 27 and don't have combat experience, considering they are prime fighting age. And in most other Western countries, that would be the population that you would turn to, of course, first and ask them to serve in the country's armed forces, considering, their level of physical fitness and their age, which is going to be higher than somebody, say, in their late 30s or anything above. But when you're a country like Ukraine and you have so many demographic issues from the Soviet collapse, and of course you want to preserve the economic future of your country, this is a concern. But the discussion continues on whether they're going to increase the amount of people from the population that they draft. They've pursued going after draft dodgers pretty aggressively. I know Zelensky fired the heads of all the local recruitment centers or all the recruitment boards. I forget the exact position, but it was the head of the recruitments for each oblast over corruption of people paying out to get out of recruitment and to get out of serving in the Ukrainian armed forces. But the point is, the 43 number is not from just Ukrainians dying it so heavily and so much. All their youth has just died. And so now it's everybody who's 43. Is for everybody in their 40s to 50s are the ones serving in the armed forces, because everybody who was young just died. It was at the start of the war, the military and the armed forces was dominated by younger contract soldiers. And then after the Russians invaded and expanded to include their whole armed forces, The Ukrainian armed forces did lose some soldiers, but also expanded to recruit the general population because they're now fighting the second most powerful military in the world, according to them, and the largest country on the planet. So I think it's much more reflective of the general demographics of a country that went through, population decline after the Soviet collapse. So I think this is just an example of TJ not knowing much about Ukrainian demographics or where that number comes from. I'm sure there are people who have, who are hiding, right? But I don't know what he means by like people who've given up. So does he mean like people who have surrendered to the Russians? I have not seen anything to indicate that the rate of surrender amongst the Ukrainian armed forces was so high that would have such a stark increase from like, oh, they have an average age of like 28 and they've gone all the way up to like 47. And just, yeah, I think it's just an instance of just TJ not knowing much about the demographics of Ukraine. I think that's what it is.
Dude, I saw
this war has been nothing but human degradation, suffering, and expenditure.
One of the bloodiest wars.
As far as I can tell, not much in the way of gains on either side as of this point. Seems like this has just been like a sufferfest with no real. I mean, maybe someone will fucking come out ahead at the end of the day. I mean, so far, I don't know.
It's the bloodiest war since the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and those went on way fucking longer than this war. So this war is probably more explosively bloody than those two wars. I mean,
it's the largest war in Europe since World War II.
Absolutely insane. And the sad truth of the matter is that Ukraine is not just running out of money; it's running out of people. Like, it's running out of capable military-aged people to stand in the trenches.
I don't know what they mean by this, because again, those draft protections between the ages of 18 to 27 for people who don't have military service, those still exist. If you do not volunteer between the ages of 18 and 27, you still have significant protections from the draft. It also exists in many countries for things like, I know, like if you have a bunch of children, like you have 5 kids and you're a dad, there's going to be protection from you from serving. There's still the protections for students, which is something that's hotly debated in this country. There are other protections as well. I don't have all of the protections from the draft in my head. I've never had to consider being drafted, even though I was on the side of the road and I was tempted to be drafted once. In Ukraine, they do need to recruit more people. That is a real thing, even if I don't think that like they're running out of people to the point where just pushing the elderly to the front. I just think it's the demographics of the country. They are trying to recruit more people, and one of the ways they do it is they send out conscription officers into the town, and they go up to people and say, give me your documents, what are you doing? And they're seeing if they're, possible for conscription. And if they're like, oh, I'm a student, then they're like, oh, get out of here. For me, I'm a foreigner, so it was like, oh, get out of here. Once I showed them my American passport, he was like, oh, I can't draft you, get out of here. And I remember talking to my conscription friend and saying, this is a very inefficient system. Like, not even just talking about the fact that, like, it's probably not the most pleasant way to be drafted. You're walking around the street and somebody takes you off the side of the road, say, are you capable? Good. Oh, okay, you're in the military. So go up to the conscription office. But it's probably not that efficient. And I remember him saying to me, yeah, it's not efficient. And we're trying to increase the effectiveness of the draft service, but so little of it is digitized. I remember the first time I talked to him, he was like in 2022, he said 1.5% of the draft, of our draft services of our operations is online. And then next time I asked him the same thing, like, oh, has it changed? He was like, yes, it has. Now it's 2.5%. So it's not just a problem of policy, it's also a problem of the effectiveness of conscription, of the effectiveness of the office, and how good they are of, well, I guess you could say bureaucracy. I know bureaucracy is not a fun word. People hate bureaucrats, but having effective bureaucrats is important, especially when it comes to calling people up for service. On many occasions, he would tell me of times of them calling people up for service, and they're like, oh, that person died like 7 years ago. I was like, oh, okay, never mind. Like old documents. This is not just a problem in Ukraine, by the way. This was also a problem in Russia. When they've had that first major wave of mobilization, they'd call up a bunch of people, and they were going off of old Soviet documents. Those people were dead. Well, those people were in their 60s. There were examples of like 60-year-old men being called up for service in Russia. So it's not just an issue of, exemptions, it's also an issue of bureaucracy. There's a bunch of issues that come into the effectiveness, or, well, I guess you could say lack of effectiveness of the Ukrainian conscription system.
Putin do, because, they obviously have a much larger supply of human beings than Ukraine does. But one of the things that Putin's doing now because of the fucking dramatic losses from this.
Also, I would say that one way to help the Ukrainians sustain more manpower would be to give them Western armor and Western equipment. When you look at the BMP-1s that the Ukrainians and the Russians are dragging out of Soviet stockpiles to put into service, those things are tin cans on wheels. They're tin cans on wheels, and they're meant to take positions with those. They're meant to hold positions with those. And if you blow up in one of those, there's a good 80 to 90% chance that your ass is dead. But when you look at things like the Bradley, or when you look at the Abrams, or when you see the armored assaults that were happening in the South in Zaporozhye using Western gear, most of the media was looking like, oh my gosh, and they were covering like the same angle of the same 17 destroyed vehicles, the same 17 destroyed Western vehicles over and over and over again. Look at these vehicles, destroyed, destroyed, destroyed. And of course they were destroyed, and war vehicles are destroyed. That happens. But something I noticed about those vehicles is 9 out of 10 of the Western vehicles that I saw destroyed on the battlefield, the hatches were open. What does that indicate? It indicates that the crew in the vehicle survived. When you look at the Soviet tanks and the tank turret flying up into the sky, that's because they store the ammo under the soldiers, not the safest. Whereas in the Abrams, they don't do it that way. They store it in a separate container. It's the same thing when it comes to the British Challenger tank. I believe also, I think the ammunition is like water cooled, so it's like an extra level. I don't know all the technical tank stuff. What I do know is that those tanks are safer for the crews. And most of the Western personnel carriers that have been provided from states like the United States, when you're talking about equipment like the Bradleys, these are vehicles that prioritize crew safety much more than 6-year-old equipment from the Soviet Union that meant to prioritize that mass armor wave. So I think one way to help them retain their manpower to the best of their ability, save the lives of their crew members, and retain that fighting experience that the tankers and those in armored mechanized divisions have, is to try to save the lives of those crews with better defensive gear, with better armored vehicles that have a higher standard, a higher quality when it comes to protecting their crews. At least that's what I think. I would, if these guys are going to be fighting a war, I think it'd be better if they fought a war in something that halfway cared if they survived or not.
War is like he's going out now and telling women to have, like, we need to go back to when, Russian women had 8 kids. All you girls need to pump out 8 kids.
Yeah, start cranking them out. Crank out more bodies, dude. More grist for the mill.
I know. It's fucking crazy. And it's just like, maybe, there's like, just, I don't know. I mean, I hate to be a hippie again, because I know that it triggers Dylan Burns. But maybe we should stop feeding this war machine. Maybe we need to stop just like laughing at the very notion of peace and stop.
Yeah.
And by the way, when you call me a hippie, the original term, like, do you know the origin, like the etymology of hippie? It means like someone who's like hip to the injustices of the world, man.
It's like woke.
It's woke. You basically just called me woke. You're basically just like, I mean, dude, at the rate you're going, in fucking 10, 15, 20 years, you're just gonna be a hardline right winger. You're already on the fucking path. Okay? So knock it off. Quit fucking warmongering. Quit sucking the fucking dick of the military industrial complex. Quit trying to funnel U.S. money that should go to the betterment of citizens of this country. Quit trying to funnel it into a war that has done nothing but cause misery, despair, and the degradation of human beings. Because Ukraine has not benefited from this, obviously. Russia has not benefited from this. No one has benefited from this. And if anyone at this point has benefited, it's been the military-industrial complex, and it's been Vladimir Putin, and maybe Joe Biden to a much more limited extent.
Okay, so I remember once somebody explained the presidency to me, and I keep bringing it up. I forget which author it was. And somebody explained it to me through that author, and I thought it really helped me when trying to understand like political leadership and how somebody guides a country or rules a country. It helped me a lot. So I think a lot of people assume that when you're president, you just kind of get to go in there and you kind of decide just how everything plays out. I'm the big man, I'm in charge, and so we're going to concentrate on this, and this. But a lot of times when you're in the office, you don't really control what crises or political problems or the political landscape that you're elected into. I'm sure that if, FDR was elected into a different political landscape, he probably would have had a different set of political priorities outside of, winning the war and recovery after the Great Depression. And I think a better way to view a U.S. president than somebody just out there like giving orders, definitely when we talk about presidents on the international stage try to deal with a crisis or a national crisis, is like a president floating, like the guy's floating down the river on a buoy, and he has a big stick, and every time a barrier like a rock or a log comes down the river, you use it to push the boat, the nation, out of the way and try to avoid the crises and deal with the crises as they come. President Joe Biden and the United States did not choose for this war to happen. The Ukrainians did not choose for this war to happen. The people who chose for this war to happen were the ones who invaded, just like they invaded in 2014 and flooded the country with their own weapons for 8 years, as we did not fulfill our commitments in the Budapest Memorandum for 8 years. The administration of Joe Biden and the Ukrainians are responding to the crisis that was brought to their doorstep. That's what's happening. And the weapons and munitions that we've given to Ukrainians have been in service in dealing with that crisis that has dropped to their doorstep. And so if the Russians were going to invade and take that land, and there was nothing we could do to dissuade them from that, and I'm waiting for the recommendation that would have been acceptable to request of the Ukrainians or for Russia to request of the West, that we would give them in order to stop this invasion, or what they requested that we could have given them that would have stopped the invasion. If the crisis has come to us, then we have to deal with the crisis and we have to deal with the war. Now, you can say that sending the weapons intensifies the bloodshed and it's pouring more weapons into the war. But at the end of the day, this isn't just a natural disaster, right? Even though both things cause tons and tons of destruction, there is a side here that is defending and a side here that is attacking and trying to conquer. And I want, and most of the international community wants, the side that is defending its territorial sovereignty, which we've made commitments to be able to take its territory back and defend its land. And the best way to do that, whether they push out the Russians directly and just push them out completely, which would be a dream, fantastic scenario, or they make a deal at the negotiating table, the more weapons and munitions they have at their disposal and the more damage that has been done to Russian hard power in the country, the better deal they can get and the better they can set up their country for the future. Because as of right now, if we were to agree to the Russian demands that they say are the preconditions to enter negotiations, the Ukrainians would be losing like something between 20 to 25% of their country, 80% of their coastline, and that assumes that it's not a non-starter and that the Russians will not continue and attack locations like Odessa and Kharkiv and Mykolaiv and other areas anyway, once the West has lost interest. Once the West is no longer paying attention, especially if we don't put a foundation like a unilateral defense pact or membership in NATO to further protect the Ukrainians. Either way, the Ukrainians need more means to defend themselves. Even if the war was to end tomorrow, we should still be sending the Ukrainians weapons and doing arms deals with them because they still need to be prepared for the next war, for the next possible invasion, since the Russians have done this before and there is a real possibility of them doing again. All of the serious realists that I've talked to, the ones that are schmucks and act not schmucks, the ones that are realists and actually want to make a deal with the Russians, even most of them who say that a deal would be favored right now, most of them that I've talked to say that there's a good chance, a more than 50% chance that even if we would enter negotiations and seriously tell the Russians, okay, we're ready, sit down, there's a good chance that we wouldn't reach an agreement. So with that possibility in mind too, again, even if we were to pursue TJ's path, we need to be ready to say no. We need to be ready to walk away if the Russians make crazy demands and be ready to keep going. We can't go there just with the idea in mind of we just need to give them whatever is necessary in order to bring about peace, because that's how you get played.
Then you have to accept Russia taking over. Let me explain something to you, simple brain. You don't, just because in your mind you have reduced the conflict in Ukraine to, there are two outcomes to this: either we eternally fund Ukraine's military until every Russian soldier in Ukraine and everyone they can send is dead, or Russia just takes over everything. I know that that's the easy way that you've boiled this down so that your simple little fucking one-note brain can wrap around it.
Morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Man, he's really digging into this Repulse Revolt guy. Man, he's digging in. Blue Rider of Neptune. Thank you so much for the primer. Did somebody else say that? Either way.
But I'm not advocating for...
I think it was the last guy. No, I forget which guy said it, but who cares?
The way that you've boiled this down so that your simple little fucking one-note brain can wrap around it. But I'm not advocating for Russia taking over everything. I'm advocating for a stronger diplomatic position from the United States. I'm asking for the United States to flex its muscles in a good way. make no bones about it. The United States, if it so chose, could have prevented one Russian boot from ever setting foot in Ukraine. Could have prevented one round being fought in open war and hostility in that region. Could have been done. All the United States had to do is take its puppet state over in fucking Europe, NATO, and allow Ukraine into NATO in the days leading up to this invasion. There's absolutely no way. Would you?
Brilliant. I don't know why anybody didn't think of that. That's crazy. Nobody thought of that. Just put Ukraine in NATO. Why didn't America just put Ukraine in NATO before the February 2022 invasion? I don't know. I mean, he was being kind of a smarmy prick there, so I can be a little bit of a smarmy prick. I don't know how the negotiators haven't been taught about it. Has Biden seen this stream? Has Zelensky seen this stream? Okay, I'll stop. Okay, ending with the kappa. Okay. If we were to have Ukraine join NATO, at that point, there'd be a few barriers for Ukrainian membership of NATO. Here's the first thing. The first thing is multiple NATO member states didn't want Ukraine to join. And I'm not just talking about Viktor Orban's Hungary, even though I don't know how in the days leading up to the February 24th invasion, as Russian troops are on the border, you go up to Viktor Orban and say, hey, are you going to vote in favor of Ukraine joining NATO? The response from Viktor Orban is either going to be no, because he doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, period, because he thinks it's going to anger the Russians to cause the invasion in the first place. Or two, he doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO because he's working with the Russians. He's working with the Russians to keep lower energy prices for the Hungarians, and they are of a somewhat similar ideological tent, which I think is part of the reason that's motivating him blocking aid to Ukraine right now. But it wouldn't just be the Hungarians. You'd also have to convince the Germans, who'd be against Ukrainian NATO membership before the invasion, and the French, who were against Ukrainian NATO membership before the invasion. Oh, and you need to convince the Turks. You need to convince the Turks as well. So you need to convince all of these countries that, and that's, I'm not even mentioning all the countries, I'm just mentioning some of the countries that give you the biggest problems. You need to convince all of these countries because you need unanimity to add somebody to NATO. I don't know if Paul knew that, but every single NATO state needs to agree for Ukraine to join NATO. It's not just America's puppet. If it was America's puppet, then Sweden would have already joined NATO since it's applied, but it hasn't. Why? Because Turkey and Hungary are holding up Swedish membership just like they held up Finnish membership until the Finns gave the Turks enough concessions when it came to, I think it was Kurdish issues. I know the Swedes are going through the same issue. But it's not just our puppet. We can't just order them to do it. If that was the case, then the Swedes would already be part of NATO and it wouldn't even be a problem. But the Ukrainians have much more problems when it comes to membership of NATO than the Swedes or the Finns have. The Swedes and the Finns are much more integrated when it comes to, the type of weapons they have and being on NATO standard munitions. The Finns and the Swedes don't have any active territorial disputes where part of their sovereign borders are controlled by another country and they're technically at war, which the Ukrainians were still technically at war for all of 2014 to 2022. It just was a semi-frozen war. So you would be adding a state to NATO while at war with a nuclear power, which could come with, some problems. And what are the odds that even if you were able to convince the Hungarians and convince the Turks and convince the French and convince the Germans, all of who was opposed to Ukrainian NATO membership, and those are just the ones I'm mentioning, there are more who would have been opposed to it. The Italians probably would have been opposed to it as well. Convincing all those people before the invasion, because you'd have to do that instead of just saying, hear ye, we give you this order. Even if you convince all of them, what are the odds that we start the application process in January as the real threat of the Russian invasion is made clear, and then the Russians are like, oh my God, they're actually going through with NATO membership. This is our justification to invade, and then they invade. How would that have stopped the invasion? Number one, how do you get the other countries to agree to add NATO, considering that they're still in an active war, parts of the territory are disputed, they're not integrated with NATO defense structures that as much, they've done some integration, not all of the integration that's necessary. How do you convince all those people to add them to NATO, despite those conditions? I don't know how you're going to achieve that. I think it's diplomatically impossible, and I think it was diplomatically impossible at the times given those conditions. But let's say you get over that part, how does that stop the Russians from just using that as a justification to invade instead of any of the other justifications they used to invade. In fact, when they invaded, part of the reason they invaded, or said they invaded, according to them, was NATO expansion. So if we just said, hey, we're about to begin the ascension process for Ukraine in the NATO, what would stop them from using that exact moment as they've got their troops on the border to then invade NATO? Unless, you know, Paul's saying we should have done this like 10 years ago in a completely separate conversation.
You want Palestine to give up land in exchange for peace? I mean, I think Palestine's given up enough land in exchange for peace at this point. Like, they've given up quite a bit.
Yeah. And
I mean, there is no, I mean, look, 90% of Palestinians have been displaced, which is exactly what, you know, Israel wants. They want it to be 100%. They want to just take, I mean, like this conflict, quote unquote, that's going on, this idea of like, we're going to root out Hamas. Basically, the end goal of that is,
I mean, if you look at the military means that Hamas is, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or the PFLP, or any of the militant groups in the Gaza Strip that are fighting Israel right now, if you look at the military means at their disposal, it's largely unguided rockets, AK-47s, suicide vests, bombs, IEDs, and some stuff with drones. They don't have an air force. They don't have like an armored tank corps or anything like that. They don't have any nuclear weapons. They don't have those means at their disposal. In fact, I would say that they are what somebody would traditionally refer to as a largely guerrilla army. Their odds of fighting and beating the Israelis in a head-to-head, one-to-one fight is basically impossible for them to do it. It's part of the reason why they're fighting as they are. And the Israelis are taking building after building, house after house, building after building, house after house. 18,000 to 20,000 people have died. Why couldn't we use the same logic that is being applied to the war in Ukraine to say, hey, if anything, I would say Hamas and the rest of these groups have less chance of beating the Israelis than the Ukrainians do of beating the Russians. Have you heard of Hamas taking back any major cities during the current engagement? I mean, think about the territory that's being fought over, the stranglehold Israel already had on Gaza. The odds are much less in the favor of the people of Gaza than they are when it comes to Ukraine, just because there's an interconnected highway system connecting Ukraine to the outside world. That doesn't exist for Gaza. So could we not use the same logic here? Even though I don't think the Palestinians should be displaced from their home, if the far-right people in Netanyahu's government, like the agriculture minister that was recently fired after saying nuke Gaza, if there was some push to, say, occupy Gaza and then claim Gaza as Israeli clay, which we don't know that to be the case. We don't know that that's going to happen, but I am putting this out here. If that was to happen, wouldn't the best scenario under this logic be for the Palestinians to, you know, suck it up and move to the West Bank or the Sinai? I don't agree with that proposal, by the way. I don't think that's what should happen. I think that the Palestinians should determine their own destiny at the end of the day. I believe in a two-state solution. I believe they deserve a state. I'm just saying, if the only thing that's determining our response here is, you know, civilians are dying, war is bad, end the war as soon as possible, I mean, wouldn't the conclusion here, if the conclusion is that Ukraine has to kind of give in to a lot of Russian demands, or the majority of Russian demands when it comes to a lot of their territory, in order to find peace because war's so bad, wouldn't the same thing apply to the Gazans? And hell, the Israelis aren't, at least we don't know of publicly, making the demand that Gaza will be integrated with an Israeli state. Whereas the Russians are making that demand quite clearly, saying that saying Ukraine is a fake country. Just putting that out there.
Is Israel's going to shore up the rest of its territory, and there's not going to be a fucking Gaza Strip anymore. It's going to be like the Palestinians are going to be pushed off to wherever they can fucking go, or they're going to be killed, and then it's all Israel, baby. Like, that's the end goal.
And that's not just TJ making some kind of assessment or pulling that out of the. That's their stated goal.
Yeah, I mean, not only is Israeli media is much more honest about this stuff than American media for some reason.
Not only is it their stated goal, they've been prosecuting the campaign to make that happen for fucking decades. They've been seizing Palestinian territory and settling it against, by the way, international law. The UN has condemned Israel's settlement policy over and over and over again. But for some reason, nobody ever wants to step up to bat and stop Israel from doing it. And this is just the next stage. They've had their big national tragedy event that they can tie to this. They got people whipped up in their country into a war frenzy, and they're going to take this opportunity to scour the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and then move Israeli settlers and Israeli corporations and Israeli-friendly corporations and Israeli shops and Israeli social.
If this is what Paul is saying is going to happen in the Gaza Strip, which I have not seen any government document. I've seen think tanks proposing it to government officials, which is extremely concerning. I really hope this doesn't happen, and I'm hoping it doesn't happen. But let's say that what Paul is saying here is true, and that is the goal of the Israelis. It is to purge the Gaza Strip. Then wouldn't if we were using the same logic, wouldn't the solution be for the Palestinians to accept the writing on the wall and leave their homes? Again, I don't think that the Palestinians should leave the Gaza Strip. I believe that the land in Gaza should belong to a future Palestinian state, just like I believe the land in Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporozhye and Kherson and all these other areas that the Russian has occupied should go to a future Ukrainian state, as within international law in both scenarios. But if the problem with the Ukrainian struggle for freedom is like, oh, the odds are just so against them, even though we could put more chess pieces on the board for them, it's not really a stalemate, as Timothy Snyder has said before. If you can just put 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 more chess pieces on the board, it isn't a game of chess, it's a war. But again, why wouldn't this logic apply the same way in both scenarios? That's why I think the logic is faulty.
Services into these areas and display.
By the way, I don't think TJ holds the exact same view here. I think this is a Paul view. TJ, at least I know he's willing to engage in war in some scenarios. Or like defensive just war.
Place an entire people into Egypt. That is the plan right now. The plan right now is to force Palestinians to flee across the southern border into Egypt and replace them with Jews. That's it. Openly stated. That is their policy. That is what they are prosecuting in Israel. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's no hims or haws. There's no other way to paint it. That is their plan. And they're prosecuting that plan right now as we sit around here piddling with our thumbs up our fucking asses, arguing about whether or not we should go vote for Genocide Joe or not.
There's a reason 60s hippies became 80s Reagan Democrats, because the useless idealism eventually gets crushed by the world's harsh realities. Well, I mean, like, your generation, assuming that you're one of these like Zoomers or whatever the fuck, doesn't even seem to have any idealism to crush. You've already started off at the position of like, let's just fucking give it all away.
I mean, I talked to him about, I guess, my idealist view, international law and, having international systems to stick up for the smaller countries and standing by our values and our commitment as a country and trying to live by the standard that we have proclaimed ourselves to live by for years while having certain hypocritical policies in place. And I remember one of the conclusions we had back and forth at the end of it was kind of like, they called me naive. I said, no, I guess I'm just a dreamer. And then I said, I thought that they were older and cynical. And I think this is getting a little bit to the heart of it.
Because it's going to be crushed out of us eventually anyway. Let's just give it up in advance.
And by the way, the
is that an intelligent position? Like, even if the reality is that the world will crush the idealism out of you, like, is that an excuse to not even fucking try? Not even have like any push whatsoever? Because like, well, eventually the enemy is going to, like, this is the ultimate form of defeatism. It's basically like, we're going to lose. We're going to fail. All of our dreams will crumble to dust. Therefore, why even dream? Why even try?
Wouldn't this not also apply to Ukrainian struggle for freedom? Just throwing it out there. This is the thing, and I've said this before. I like a lot of the progressive ferocity for issues like healthcare reform and progressive ferocity on issues like drug decriminalization. I was like, oh yeah, you know what? I can get behind this. I can get behind this. I just wish I could see that for, that same level of furiosity for a war where, a group of people were dumped into mass graves due to their national identity.
That's like supposed to be like the great struggle of history, right? Wasn't this the very thing that Vosh was romanticizing when he argued with us, that like, you got to fucking continue the fight for generations and generations, even if it seems hopeless, but then you're going to give me this like, well, we've already lost. You got to just fucking acquiesce to the world's harsh realities. Like, no.
They want it both ways. They rhetorically want it both ways. They want to act like they're participating in the struggle by capitulating to what the ruling class wants them to do. And it just that never will jive in my head.
By Paul's logic, yes, there's no way the Palestinians can win, so they should just give up and negotiate some land to give to the Israelis. There's no negotiation with Israel at this point.
This is another thing you tiny brains try and do to justify your war position. There's
not a 1-for-1 comparison between these two.
Not at all. The history of these two places is couldn't be more different.
Well, then what's the history that makes it bad for the Palestinians to give up their land, but okay for the Ukrainians to give up their land?
And the fucking the just entire existence of these conflicts couldn't be more different.
Because let me just be clear, my position is the Palestinians don't give up their land, the Ukrainians don't give up their land. And guide in line with international law on what is the internationally defined borders of what should be a Palestinian state and what should be a Ukrainian state. And was, according to Vladimir Putin, completely acceptable when he was interviewed in 2008 after the invasion of Georgia, and people were scared of this exact scenario, saying that there's no ethnic issues in Ukraine, everything's fine, everything's fine. But apparently in the last 14, 15 years, it's just gotten so bad in Ukraine that no, it's not fine. It's necessary to give up the land. Not saying that that's their position, it's just a position that frustrates me.
And you want to paint them as the same thing because you think it's convenient to your fucking shitty argument. Nope, sorry, I'm not in 3rd grade, bro. I'm not in 3rd grade.
The point doesn't get nearly enough oxygen, but Ukraine and Russia didn't even want to fight each other. Russia won massively on balance economically through BRICS.
What does that even mean? The Russians invaded, so they wanted, obviously they wanted to fight because they invaded. They just think it would be a long fight. They thought it would be an easy fight. They underestimated their opponent.
Enough about what you're telling me there.
He's talking about the establishment of BRICS and how that ultimately is going to be a huge win for Russia, while Ukraine really isn't going to gain much other than a bunch of fucking fresh graves from this. And he's pretty right about that. I mean,
the Russians have gone back like 15 years in the development of a modern armed forces, losing 87% of the troops it had prior to the start of the war, losing much of the VDV, much of their experienced troops, much of their modern equipment, with their military spending now exceeding their social spending. We're seeing the relationships with allies like Armenia get strained. We're seeing organizations like Wagner, which was designated as a terrorist organization due to the activities engaged in, including torture, execution, sledgehammering, which you can look up on your own time. They've been basically annihilated by the Ukrainian armed forces and semi-annihilated themselves in Bucha and then on their mad run towards Moscow. But the Russians are losing stuff too. The Russians are just going to gain from the war. I mean, the Russians will gain from the war if we allow them to gain land and able to use it as a propaganda victory for the Russian administration before then they continue to encroach. I mean, why would us giving the Russians like more land, even more than they currently are holding on to, how would this not just further embolden them and send the message that actually the strategy is working? So just wait another 5, 6, 7 years like you did last time and try this in Moldova.
BRICS looks like it's not, you know.
And again, the Ukrainians are, people saying, oh, they're getting as mass graves. Even if the war was to end today, them taking back Kherson, like the people I met in Kherson, they deserve to have their own country. They deserve to vote. They deserve to be able to express themselves freely. They deserve to be able to protest against their government or share critiques or vote against people and other parties or vote against the administration before or against who's in power. They deserve to have a free and fair judicial system. They deserve to purge their government of corruption and not have it embedded into the system as it is in Russia. And as the Russians wanted it to be here and worked with people like Yanukovych, who was deeply embedded with organized crime to do that, and has worked with criminals all up and down occupied territory. They deserve all these things. And so even if the war was to end tomorrow, liberating Kherson and liberating much of the Kharkiv Oblast, liberating over 50% of the territory that they took since the 2022 invasion, that would all still be worthwhile things to have fought for. Fighting for Kiev, that was a worthwhile thing to have fought for, and I don't think you can find many people in Kiev who would have told you, nah, they should have rolled over. It wasn't worth fighting for Kiev. This whole theory that Paul has built up is based upon the fact that he thinks that the whole war could have been avoided if we just like told NATO to accept Ukraine. I really think it just comes from a complete lack of knowledge of some of the basic history of the war, which I think is quite disappointing that he's saying such boldly wrong things with no knowledge on the subject.
It's going to be like a player on the fucking world stage as an economic zone. It's trying to challenge the hegemony of the West.
By the way, I just want to say that if Ukraine loses 80% of its coastline as a grain producing state that exports its grain by water, which transporting grain by rail is like 9 to 10 times more expensive than transporting grain by water. Yeah, I think losing all that territory would be pretty devastating as well. I just want to throw that out there.
Good thing for Russia in the long run.
Jack Smith to use Trump's phone data at...
Okay, that's enough of that. Deep fat fried. Yeah, man, look, I love TJ, even if he's a hippie and I still disagree with him. But Paul, who has just called himself hippie on this one, I think he genuinely just doesn't know what he's talking about, and he's just making assertions about the diplomatic history of the United States, Russia, NATO, and Ukraine. He's just kind of like making up scenarios that were just never possible. And I think it just comes from a lack of knowledge. I think it just comes from a position of ignorance, not even necessarily malice. I don't sense any malice. I think it genuinely just comes from he doesn't know.